Welcome, my friends, to another edition of More Bad News brought to you, as always, by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camels Challenge, smoke Camels for 30 days, and see for yourself what a difference tobacco can make in your life. It wasn't until the 1900s that cigarettes were made and sold as a major tobacco product. It was a combination of the industrialization and World War I that resulted in cigarettes replacing pipes as the most common method of smoking. In World War I, soldiers began to realize that those who smoked pipes were more likely to get their heads shot or while lighting up their pipe. Cigarettes presented their own danger, but was far less than the traditional pipe. Today, the world's largest consumer of cigarettes is China. That's right. As we abandon the product that made us great, the Chinese have embraced it, and their economy has been smoking ever since. So, if not for yourself, do it for your country. Smoke Camels and make America great again. Well, it's been another week of bad news. Scientists reported last week that the Thwaites Glacier, known as the Doomsday Glacier, because its collapse spells an ocean rise of 3 to 10 feet, which will threaten the lives of 40% of the human population. Uh, After recent mapping of the glacier in high resolution, a group of international researchers found that the glacier had experienced a phase of rapid retreat over a duration of less than 6 months in the past 2 centuries. Researchers are now worried that the glacier is retreating faster than at any time in its history and could collapse in a matter of months. And it's not called the Doomsday Glacier for nothing. The bad news is that the collapse of our ecosystem is proceeding exponentially, not arithmetically. Processes that we thought would take centuries are now taking place within our lifetime. One of the key measures of human progress has been the advance of global life expectancy. Here in the US, life expectancy more than doubled from 1900 to 2000. In 1900, the average life expectancy was 47 for men and 49 for women. By 2000, men could expect to live to 75 and women to 80. With the onset of the pandemic, global life expectancy has plummeted over the past couple of years. This represents the first decline in global life expectancy since the 1950s, the first year for which global estimates are available from the United Nations. By the end of 2021, global annual declines in life expectancy were exceeding 2 years in at least 50 different countries. Since 1950, annual declines of that magnitude had only been observed on rare occasions, such as Cambodia during the genocide of the 1970s and Rwanda during the genocide of the 1990s. And now we're facing the onset of global starvation. The UN warned this week that 6 million Afghans and 22 million Somalis are facing the immediate threat of famine. Well, today I wanted to start with a few words about Jamestown, the first permanent British colony in North America. This is where our story really begins. The first point I'd like to make is that Jamestown was a joint stock company. That is, it was a business enterprise. The United States is a uniquely business-oriented society. We have more entrepreneurs than any other society in the world. I would often ask my students, by show of hands, how many of them wanted to own their own business. In the US, owning your own business has always been a major aspiration. But go to England and ask the same question, and very few will enthusiastically raise their hands. Most Europeans grow up wanting to earn a living doing some kind of service, government or industry. Spanish and French colonies were established by the crown. The Spanish and French sent soldiers, priests, workers, and physicians. The government covered all the expenses of settlement and conquest. The British colonies, on the other hand, were business ventures, which were not supported by the crown. And profits in the early years were elusive. There was no gold or other minerals, and hopes of finding the Northwest Passage through North America to China also didn't pan out. In all of these hopes, the original investors and settlers received a rude shock. Rather than duplicating the remarkable success of the Spanish and Portuguese in Mexico, Peru, and Brazil, the early Virginia colonists died miserably of dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition. More than 900 settlers, mostly men, arrived in Jamestown between 1607 and 1609. Only 60 survived the winter of 1609. There weren't enough healthy men to bury the dead and dying. The dead. The English found that the indigenous people could not be easily subjected. Contrary to expectations, no wealthy empire lay waiting to be conquered, nor could the Virginians mold the 20,000 Powhatan Indians in the region into a servile labor force, because unlike the Spanish, the English had no army of conquistadors. Instead, relations with the Powhatan turned bitter from the beginning. Powhatan brought supplies of corn to the sick and starving Jamestown colony during that first autumn. However, when John Smith raided Indian corn supplies and tried to cow the local tribes by a show of force, the Powhatan withdrew their trade with the English, and this led to the starving times of the first year. Despite these early failures, the Virginia colony of London poured more money and settlers into the venture. Understanding the need for ordinary farmers who could raise food and necessary to sustain the colony, they reorganized the company in 1609. To entice new settlers, they promised free land at the end of 7 years working for the company. In 1618, they sweetened the deal by offering 50 acres of land outright to anyone journeying to Virginia on their own dime. To the thousands of people on the margins of English society, such an offer was irresistible. More than 9,000 crossed the Atlantic to Virginia between 1610 and 1622, yet only 2,000 remained alive at the end of that period. Instead of a plantation, wrote one English critic, the Virginia colony was a slaughterhouse. What drove young men to such desperate risks? To understand this, I have a little homework assignment for you. Imagine that you're a landless peasant and the cost of wood has gone through the roof so that you can no longer afford wood to cook with or heat your home. What to do? So this is what I want you to do. Here in Michigan, there are lots of great dairy farms. You need to go out to a field where the cows graze and collect cow chips, dried cow dung. It ought to look like a Frisbee and be really nice and dry. In England, the peasantry was priced out of wood and reduced to using dried cow dung for cooking and heating. So here's what I want you to do. Get yourself a shopping bag full of cow chips and some dogs and hamburger, and invite your friends over to the backyard barbecue. Load up the grill with the cow chips, douse them with lighter fluid, and party on. Food cooked this way has a very unique flavor, a lot like shit. And that, my friends, is what drove the English peasantry to America. It was the idea that America had endless forests, and unlike England, where land was owned by the nobility, in America, land was a commodity that was readily bought and sold. Risking your life coming to America was the only chance you had to own land. Even though the colony proved a burial ground for most immigrants, the promise of free land lured a steady stream of settlers to Virginia. It was Francis Drake's boatload of the Jovial Weed, so called because it was a great intoxicant, in 1586, that popularized tobacco smoking among the English upper class. Despite King James' denunciation that smoking was loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs, Sot Weed, as tobacco was called, became Virginia's salvation. Planters shipped the first crop in 1617, and tobacco cultivation spread rapidly. Commanding a handsome price, it allowed a profit sufficient for the settlers to plant even in the streets of Jamestown. By 1624, Virginia was exporting 200,000 pounds of tobacco, and by 1638, even though the price had plummeted, the colony was exporting 3 million pounds per year. Tobacco was to Virginia in the 1620s what sugar was to the West Indies and silver to Mexico and Peru. In London, men jibed that Virginia was built on smoke. The cultivation of tobacco also obliged Virginia planters to find a reliable supply of cheap labor. Tobacco required intensive care through the various stages of planting, weeding, thinning, worming, cutting, curing, and packaging. To fill their need, planters recruited immigrants mostly from England and Ireland. These immigrants were called indentured servants. They sold a portion of their work lives in exchange for passage to America. About 4 of every 5 17th century immigrants to Virginia came as an indentured servant. Nearly 3/4 of them were male and mostly between 15 and 24 years of age. Most of the indentured servants came from the armies of landless peasants driven off their land by the enclosure movement. Others were orphans, political prisoners, or common criminals who came to escape the gallows. Some were simply kidnapped. Like the Africans, many white indentured servants came involuntarily. They were spirited here by unscrupulous recruiters. What you had is that you down by the dock, um, the ship was going to sail at high tide, and the captain would order his boatswain's mate to go down to the bars and recruit or spirit. We need 20 more. We have room for 20 more indentures. Go and get me them before morning. And so the boatswain would go down to the bar, and he would announce that they were sailing at dawn, and they were celebrating free drinks on the house for everybody. And this 18-year-old kid would free drinks. Wow, he'd get himself really soused up. And 2 o'clock in the morning, as he's trying to leave the bar, he finds himself knocked over the head, dragged off to the ship. The next day, he wakes up with an incredible headache, finding himself on the way to America. Not very different than the way African slaves were brought to America. Life for indentured servants often turned out to be a nightmare. Only a handful, perhaps 1 in 20, realized the dream of achieving freedom and acquiring land. If malarial fevers or dysentery didn't quickly kill them, the servants often succumbed to the brutal work routine imposed by harsh masters. Even by the middle of the 17th century, when the starving times it was only a memory, about half of the indentured servants died during the first few years of their seasoning. Here's the point. America was a land of opportunity, but it was also a land of extreme risk. It is often noted that Europeans look to their government for security, while Americans tend to look to their government for opportunity. America may have been a brutal place, but it was the only place where a person could go from poverty to wealth. So we'll leave it here. Next week, we'll continue the exciting adventure of the creation of the global market for tobacco consumption. Remember, folks, we did this. Long before Coke taught the world to sing in perfect harmony, Virginia Tobacco taught the world to smoke in perfect ignorance.